Hello and welcome to another Ancient Warfare magazine podcast. You may or may not be aware that Ancient Warfare has a sister publication, Medieval Warfare, which I also help produce. You can find more information on the magazine at medieval-warfare.com. Peter, the host, recently recorded an episode discussing with Michael Livingston and Kelly DeVries which medieval battle would they like to have witnessed. I thought it was a great idea, so I stole it for the Medieval Warfare podcast. So joining me today are Jasper Otage, Murray Darb and Marc DeSantis. I thought it was an interesting idea for us to do as an in-betweener, because I have no doubt that everyone has different things that they'd like to draw out. But also, I mean, when I thought, well, it's an interesting exercise, and the first one I came up with, the siege of the Sogdian Rock, which is where Alexander defeats the king of Bactria, and his wife and daughter flee to the impregnable hilltop fortress, and Alexander decides to send 300 warriors up overnight to climb to the top. And then I thought, well, is that something I'd like to witness? Actually, that's a bit boring, because it probably did. It's a wonderful story. It's a love story through space and time where Alexander meets Roxana. But it did strike me as being not necessarily a spectacle to have witnessed in the ancient world. It doesn't really answer any questions. If there's criteria, I guess, for why you'd want to witness something. So I just wondered if you guys want to start. Marc, do you want to start? Because you came up with a couple I thought were interesting. Do you want to give us one of yours that you'd like to witness? You'd like to have witnessed?
Sure. My first choice is the Battle of Mylae from 260 BC. This was a naval battle between the Romans and the Carthaginians, fought off the coast near modern Milazzo, Sicily, not too far from the Toe of Italy, the Straits of Messina. There are a number of reasons why I think this would be an excellent choice to want to witness. First, it was a naval battle, and I think it would be very informative to see how war galleys actually engaged in combat. Most war galley combat involved either ramming or boarding actions. They were not particularly fast, at maybe a sprint speed over very short distances. Perhaps you could attain 10, 11, 12 knots. So these were low-speed affairs when they were rammed. The typical war galley was doing damage to another, not so much by its speed, but mainly the mass of the warship that was channeled via the heavy bronze ram at its bow. The reason why I think also that, and there are many naval battles involving war galleys, but the reason why I chose the Battle of Mylae from the First Punic War was that first, or apart from actually it being a naval battle, I would get to see the famed and mysterious Corvus boarding bridge in operation. The Corvus boarding bridge is described by Polybius as being a 36-foot long, and these are approximate distances that have been translated into imperial measurements, but about 36-foot long gangplank, which was attached to a 24-foot high pole at the bow of a Roman war galley. It was raised via a rope tied to a ring at the far end of the gangplank, beneath which was a long spike. The rope was passed up through the top, over the top of the 24-foot high pole through a pulley. So Romans on the deck of their own ship would pull it, raise the bridge, and then drop it onto the deck of a Carthaginian vessel once it closed. The purpose of the Corvus was therefore, and Corvus is Latin slang for raven. So the idea was that the spike at the end of the gangplank was like a bird's beak, I guess you would say. was that once the spike impaled the Carthaginian ship, the Carthaginian war galley would be held fast. Roman marines, which were legionaries, just happened to serve aboard ship. They did not have a specific, distinct marine corps. Would run across. I'm talking the middle of the 3rd century BC. The Romans would run across and fight it out as a boarding action against the Carthaginians, who were seeking to ram. They had much better rowing skills, and therefore they were not interested in engaging in boarding action, but would rather ram, sink an opponent that way, retreat, and then ram again. So the Corvus is interesting, not merely in the sense of I would like to see it in operation, because Polybius gives only a very bare bones description in Book 1 about the Corvus. Essentially, whatever I told you is that's what it was. But it's a war-winning weapon. It allows the Romans from essentially the very beginning of this is their first big naval battle, the Battle of Mylae, to even the odds against the Carthaginians. And they win pretty much every naval battle in the First Punic War against much more talented and mariners in the form of the Carthaginians. I would like to know what it was that the Corvus did, and what, for example, what was the real advantage of its use? Is it just like Polybius said? But it actually goes even further than merely seeing the Corvus in operation. Polybius says, he posits the introduction of the Corvus this way. I'll backtrack a bit. The Carthaginians are dominant at sea. The Romans are dominant on land in Sicily. The Romans discover that they can take territory in Sicily, but the coastal cities are constantly being frightened by the Carthaginian fleet, which appears offshore, and it detaches the Sicilian cities from their allegiance to Rome. The Carthaginian fleet was also raiding Italy's shores. So the Romans decide, well, we have to get a fleet of our own so that we can protect ourselves and also keep the Sicilian cities from being brought over into allegiance with Carthage. So in 60 days, they build 100 quinquiremes and 20 triremes. So effectively, the first large Roman fleet is built in a crash program in possibly 261, 260. The first, the quinquiremes especially, they're all based on a single captured Carthaginian example, or quinquireme, which was wrecked ashore several years before. They build these ships. When they are fitted out, 17 of them are taken by Consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, who ends up getting his fleet cornered and captured in the Lipari Isles in 260. The rest of the Roman fleet, and he's taken prisoner himself, the rest of the Roman fleet, so presumably the remaining 103 ships, sails south to Sicily, where on the way, they encounter a Carthaginian fleet of 50 ships under the command of Hannibal Gisco. Now, this Hannibal Gisco was the same commander who had captured the 17 Roman ships under the command of Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio at Lipara. He approaches this Roman fleet, and Polybius says that he lost over half of his fleet in combat with the Romans in a battle at the Cape of Italy. This is not the Battle of Mylae. This is a separate encounter, as per Polybius. Now, I take more than half of his ships, meaning 26 or more. Polybius is himself not specific as to how many are lost. After the Romans soundly thump this Carthaginian fleet, they then put in, in Sicily, where they make contact with Gaius Duilius, who is the other consul for 260, and they tell him, what's happened, and Gaius Duilius now has to take command of the fleet because he finds out that the rest of the Carthaginian fleet is somewhere offshore, and he's going to go and challenge them in battle. This is where the introduction of the Corvus is. Polybius says that someone suggested to them, he doesn't say who, he just says someone there in Sicily suggested that if the Romans themselves were disappointed with the handling of their ships. They felt that their ships were slow and sluggish, and this is even though they had solidly trounced the Carthaginians at the Cape battle, they thought that their handling left a lot to be desired. So someone suggested that if they put this Corvus boarding bridge on each of their ships, they would be more effective in combat with the Carthaginians. And so then, there's no exact time frame for what's going on, but if you read Polybius, it seems that this is all happening relatively quickly. The Romans decide, okay, what we'll do is that we'll put this boarding bridge on our ships and go into battle and fight the Carthaginians. As per Polybius, they then meet the 103 Roman ships with the Corvus at their bows, meet a fleet of 130 Carthaginian ships, and Hannibal Gisgo is still is the admiral in command of the Carthaginians, and he sees the Romans approach, and Polybius says that they were full of confidence and they raced out ahead. They had contempt for the Romans as being unskilled mariners, and they raced ahead. 30 Carthaginian ships were like a vanguard, raced ahead of the others, just straining to get to the grips with the Romans. And the Romans made contact with them. The Corvus falls, and the Carthaginians were heavily defeated. And then the rest of the Carthaginian fleet appears, and the Romans defeat them too. And that's the Battle of Mylae that I just described. And the interesting thing to me about Polybius's description is that it raises so many more questions than it answers. For instance, if I could view the Battle of Mylae, I think that I would be able to determine whether or not this alleged battle at the Cape of Italy was actually historical. There are severe doubts as to whether or not Polybius is recounting an actual battle, or whether or not he was recounting. He was somehow mistaking the Carthaginian version of the Battle of Mylae with the Roman version of the Battle of Mylae. So, for example, two sources that Polybius was using when he wrote his history of the First Punic War. One was from Fabius Pictor, the Roman historian, whereas the other one was from Philinus, a Sicilian Greek from the city of Agrigentum. And it seems more likely than not that Polybius's description of the origin of the Corvus and his story about how they had this first battle at the Cape of Italy, and then decided that, our ships aren't good enough, so let's put this boarding bridge on to enhance our fighting power. It doesn't all add up. And so for me, being able to see Mylae, I think would be an especially useful thing, because I would be able to tell, for example, were the Carthaginians, just to the point of fact, if the Carthaginians had been severely defeated by the Romans at the Battle of the Cape of Italy, I find it very hard to believe that they would be so contemptuous of the Romans in this next battle, which apparently didn't occur too much later in time. So I would say that the Battle of Mylae would be a really good battle to witness.
Well, I think that raises the issue with virtually all ancient battles. We'd like to see what actually happened, and when you've got Polybius, I don't believe there's any other surviving source. He's it. So questions are raised about a single source saying this is what happened, whereas with some of the other battles, of course, where we have not only multiple sources surviving, but contradictory multiple sources, you'd want to see it, almost any ancient battle, just to go, well, actually, what did happen, and work out whose version is reliable for whatever reason. Is Livy better than Polybius on the battles of the Second Punic War? Could you actually work out what happened at the Battle of Leuctra, what happened at the Battle of Actium? Almost any battle you start to name, you can say, well, we could actually, eyewitness and corroborate those battles to see if our sources are in fact reliable, or if they're as bad as some modern academics describe them.
I agree, and in fact, I find the Corvus to be even more fascinating for a number of other reasons. The Corvus, as I mentioned earlier, it was a weapon that enabled Rome to gain victory at sea in their very first encounters with the Carthaginian fleet. It's mentioned by Polybius as having been in use in 256 BC at the gigantic Battle of Ecnomus. It was presumably at use at the Battle of Cape Hermaeum in 255 BC. And then it's not mentioned again by Polybius or by anyone. It doesn't figure in any of the following battles. And this is interesting because, for instance, the one Rome battle the Romans lost to the Carthaginians in naval battle in the First Punic War was the Battle of Drepana at 249 BC. And they were pinned against the Sicilian coast by the Carthaginian fleet, and it would have, presumably the Corvus would have enabled them to keep the Carthaginians at bay if they had it on their ships. The mere fact that they were pinned against the coast and soundly defeated, the logical presumption is that the Corvus was no longer on their decks. Well, why not? The suggestion is that the Corvus, for whatever reason, or I should say for whatever reason, was top-heavy. It rendered the Roman quinquiremes top-heavy, and that they became very unstable in inclement weather. The Romans lost more ships to storms during the First Punic War than they lost to enemy action. There were two enormous storms, one in 255 BC, and I want to say the next was in 253 BC, in which they lost tens of thousands of men. And the idea is it goes like this. The Corvus was a very useful weapon, but it was top-heavy, and in bad weather, it could be disastrous. And so the Romans stopped using the Corvus, and that's why it's no longer on Roman ships, no longer mentioned. It doesn't explain Polybius's silence as to why they no longer used it, but that's the theory. My belief, though, is that why would the Corvus have necessarily been something that the Romans could not take down relatively quickly and easily? For instance, when going to battle, masts on war galleys were ordinarily taken down and even left at shore, and it was actually not an especially difficult task to remove masts. Why would the Corvus have been something that could not have been taken down when a Roman fleet was simply traveling from point A to point B and not being, when battle was not expected? It also seems to me that there's the question of, well, what exactly was the Corvus itself? Now, I want to see the Corvus in operation. There's a suggestion, which I think is very logical, that the Corvus was not necessarily some sort of it was using not a separate dedicated pole around which to swing the boarding bridge, but was in fact somehow attached to the boat mast, which was the shorter mast at the prow of the ship. That would make a lot more sense than putting a second pole on. Now, if that pole, if the boarding bridge was connected to the actual boat mast, masts are easy to take down. Why would the Romans leave this thing up and potentially render the ship top-heavy when it wasn't necessary? Another thing that is also puzzling, the Romans had already had their ships were top-heavy in the form of the marines that they carried on their deck. That is, the ordinary complement of marines on board a Roman quinquireme was 40, and when battle was expected, they put another 80 men on board, so there was 120. Those 120 men would have far outweighed the weight of a wooden pole and the boarding bridge itself. So it seems to me that whatever top heaviness that the Roman quinquereme would have had from this boarding bridge would have been literally outweighed by the marines that they carried on board. So it does not add up that, well, we have to take the bridge off because it makes our ships top heavy, when that would have been not nearly the most weighty thing that they carried on board. It's not something that we have an answer to. It just is one of those mysteries as to what exactly happened to the Corvus, and how is it in operation. I think we could, simply by viewing this battle, we could learn a lot about this very important and very mysterious weapon called the Corvus.
Would you be disappointed if you didn't learn anything, and other than they thought it was a bit workaday, and it kind of operated in a rather simplistic manner, and actually, all this time later, we've been overthinking something that gets by the by mentioned.
Yeah. I was going to say that ancient shipping doesn't survive inclement weather anyway. Xerxes loses half his fleet.
He lost at least one, maybe two fleets during the war against Sextus Pompeius.
Yeah,
though it's been supposed that they would have had the Corvus, probably just bad timing. Getting your ships out at sea when there was a storm.
The storms in the Mediterranean, they come from nowhere and they destroy modern shipping. So, I remember being at a dinner party, and one of the guests arrived by boat, and there was a storm coming. And it was amazing because basically within 20 minutes of this guest who swam ashore, and then she had in her sealed bag, she had her dress for the evening. It was hilarious. I was the chef. I was cooking for a dinner party for 12. That was my working honeymoon actually on Scythed. I read Herodotus on the coast of Scythed, reading about the Persian fleet passing Scythed. It was quite amazing. Poor old wife was like, "Oh my God, you're such a geek." I'm like, "Yeah, but it's so cool." But the storm was, the sea level rose and was just destroyed the ship, the little zodiacs we had in the bay. So any ancient shipping that was caught in that would be completely smashed to pieces. So they had to beach. They had to, So I think the idea that they were top heavy is like, well, that's redundant because they would get destroyed in inclement weather, and you couldn't operate in inclement weather. I don't believe there's any ancient naval battle with inclement weather as part of the one of the considerations for any of our source material. There's sort of that understanding that in order to operate, it needed to basically be a mill pond, so you could row around on the field of battle. So it's a tricky thing. Caesar crosses to the Balkans, and the bravery of when he does it is the idea that even though it's a very short trip, it's the time of year that he undertakes it because the weather could turn so quickly.
I do believe also that the Corvus, in terms of modern historiography of the device, there's a whole cottage industry of various reconstructions of how it had to have functioned, and most of them end up adding things that Polybius himself does not say are there. That is, it strikes me as being is that you really just needed the rope, the pulley, and somehow to maneuver the end of it so that you could swing it around. But I think that its operation itself was relatively simple. That's at least my theory, my understanding from what I see from Polybius. But it would be certainly interesting just to know, was it the boat mast, and where and how exactly did it operate? Why is it that the Carthaginians, it seems that they were never able to come up with an adequate response or counter to the Corvus. That is almost every battle, the Corvus falls, it embeds itself in the Carthaginian ship, the Romans run across and take over the Carthaginian vessel, and the Carthaginians don't seem to have been able to figure out a way to stop that. And it would be certainly interesting to see what made it so effective.
Marjo, I think, there's, again, when you're talking about that, there's so many things in ancient warfare that are either omitted or are mentioned like we should know what they're talking about. The athismos of hoplite battle, and you could destroy entire academic careers by, I just went there, time travel, and this is how it works. So your entire, 3 decades of academia is just gone, and all the theories of how these things work, and how ranks changed in a shield wall, how the Roman legions functioned in battle, how the triple line worked. All of those things could be solved so quickly, and even things like the Kira ballista. There are several reconstructions of how the Kira ballista works, and they've made them to say it works, but they're all based on various additions to our source material, and we actually have books that tell us how to build one, and yet still people go, whoa, that can't be right. I'll change that, but no, my measurements are wrong. And I think all of those to go, well, that's one. Look, I see it over there. I'm going to take that apart, and that'll tell us how it works. There's so many battles where that.
Yeah, would you be allowed to bring your iPhone? That'd be so useful.
Yeah. Wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And do we also get audio for these witnessing too? I was going to say, if we have audio, we might be able to hear a lot of interesting things going on.
Everybody take a friend with photographic memory.
So Jasper, what would you have liked to have? What ancient battle would you have liked to have witnessed?
There's so many ancient battles we barely know where they actually happened. So that'd be useful if you could bring some
GPS.
GPS, yeah, bring a GPS. So I was actually here. All those diligent Germans from the early 20th century, they got it all wrong, or they got it right.
Best when they get it wrong, though, because then you go, and when I come back to my own time, I'm going to go and start digging over here. Oh, look, I found an ancient battle site. Oh, lucky me.
Maybe finally saw the Teutoburg forest. I mean,
yeah.
Is it really an earth-shattering discovery? Is it really? Oh, look, it's not that piece of woodland; it's this piece of woodland.
But the Teutoburg forest is the one that everybody's fascinated by, and most of the world is convinced it's not. It's in Kalkriese, in northern Germany, where it happened, because that site fits the narrative so wonderfully well. But apparently now even the Kalkriese Museum themselves are starting to become a bit more doubtful, because there's a little spoiler plug, shameless self-promotion. There's a little article in the next issue, Ancient Warfare. Because the whole dating of the Kalkriese site is based on what's called the Haltern horizon. Haltern being a fortress on the Lippe that everybody thought had been destroyed and abandoned in AD 9. So anything finds-wise that matches Haltern in Kalkriese means Kalkriese is AD 9, or at least no later than AD 9. But now they're pretty convinced that Haltern is actually the camp that is mentioned in our sources as Alesia, was attacked by German warriors, but successfully defended by the Romans, and then remained in use for a couple of years later during the Germanic campaigns of Germanicus. So that means that the whole horizon moves several years up, and therefore most likely Kalkriese is related to those campaigns, but not probably not the actual site of the Bavarian disaster. What it is then is, another story. So what happened there? I mean, would it be very interesting to see? I mean, it's I suppose the Bavarian disaster story. What you would see is just a Roman army getting strung out further and further, and getting more and more exhausted by little attacks and bigger attacks, and horrible weather and getting slowly ground down until it just falls apart.
It's probably an underwhelming thing to actually see the battle because it's there's no big set piece. It's that long stringing out of wiggling away.
There may have been it's not really a set piece, but there probably is some sort of climax where it just completely falls apart. They lose formation and that's it fits so well at Calgary. It's the frustrating part. I don't know if just for the benefit of our listeners, the Calgary story is they come up from the Weser summer camps. They get attacked. They get sort of pushed into this area. The Teutoburg, what we call the Teutoburg forest, is the word forest in the sources is saltus, and saltus can also be a narrows, and Calgary is a perfect narrows. It's on the northern edge of the Calgary berg, so it's a mountain probably would call it a high hill. It's a forested high hill, and on the northern edge, there is a swamp, and there's only a very narrow path in between. So you get this Varus's column, the story is, gets harassed and squeezed into this narrows, and then Germanic warriors attack from they've reinforced the northern edge of that mountain, and they attack from across that fortification. They attack the Roman column, and the fines actually seem to split up in sort of like it's been like the column itself is split up in one sort of petering out going southwest and one going northwest. People trying to escape from the narrows in various directions. So it fits so wonderfully well, but it may have been that something else happened there. Maybe it's a battle we don't even really know about. Maybe it's one of the battles described in Tacitus' annals about Germanicus campaigns. But yeah, I mean, what you want to see? Well, any Roman battle would be interesting because we would finally see how the legion, as Murray said, see how the legion functions, see how the legionaries work together, how they balance their need for standing out with their famous disciplina. All of them, I would say. I want to see all of them because it would answer so many questions. Or, of course, if we could record it all and then not tell anybody, we could sort of slowly drip feed it through, 100 years of ancient warfare issues.
Well, for us, there's no battle I think we wouldn't want to see. I would be happily view any of these battles. From a scholarly perspective.
Yeah, if offered the chance to see a completely inconsequential actual ancient battle that even isn't recorded in any written source, we'd be like, yep, there.
Yeah, exactly. It would be so much. It would be like finding, several volumes of ancient sources that describe stuff in detail.
Of course, we've not at all touched upon the horrific carnage. The battle scene.
Yeah, it might be somewhat traumatizing for our puny Western minds.
Even combat veterans of today, just in terms of the sheer close brutality of it all. You're in close proximity to everyone you're killing. You're not gunshot away. You're stabbing them in the throat. But I think the other thing is, of course, that when we think of ancient battles being eyewitnesses to them, we're thinking in terms of, almost drone-like footage of maps rather than, like with Teutoburg of Old, and you may have touched this because that's when my computer froze, but, you're going to be in one spot and you're only going to know what's going on around you and see. No, unfortunately. Well, if it's one of those flying dreams where you're flying over the battle site, then fabulous. Like the shot in Oliver Stone's Alexander. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's that idea. Can you know what's happening in the battle if you're in it, or even if you're the commander in it? That's all of those sort of how were commands, how were they communicated? Was it flags? Was it runners? Was it whistles? Was it the cornice calls? Who knows? All of those sorts of things you could solve in an instant if you witnessed one battle. But the other thing, of course, is that as soon as you came back, then every academic would disagree with you because what are you talking about? You're in.
But also, you would go, "Oh, drat! I forgot to pay attention to that."
Well, exactly. Your report might be no better because it's still from one perspective than somebody else's original report. You may only muddy the water. When someone says, "What happens with you?" Went, "Oh, yeah, Jasper said I forgot to check that. There was so much else going on, and I could only see this from my vantage point. So that's all I can report. So your report might be just as faulty."
From the source material, you often get the sense that the battles were fought over, in terms of a battle line, such distances that one flank wouldn't necessarily know what was happening on the other end of the line. So, for example, the Battle of Gaugamela, you have Alexander charging home and driving away Darius, and once he has accomplished that, he gets urgent word from the left flank under Parmenio that he's under a lot of pressure and he needs help. Essentially, Alexander has to turn away from his pursuit of Darius and go to the rescue of Parmenio. That's at least the story as delivered via Arrian. And if we had a drone-like perspective that is somewhere hovering above the battlefield to see what it was like, that would be something that nobody. What's that? Right. No one in the ancient world would have necessarily had that kind of view, except maybe in exceptional circumstances if a commander had been able to find some high ground where it gave him a view of the entire field of battle. But I wonder that obviously was not necessarily available to every general in an ancient battle. That is, many of these generals were fighting somewhere within their own line and could only see what was going on in a particular place. Alexander certainly was not staying behind the lines to oversee the entire army in battle. He was leading the cavalry charge, so he would not have known all that was going on at any one particular time.
It's actually interesting that so many. If you think about all the questions that might pop in your head if you saw an ancient battle, to what extent is there actual maneuvers going on, and who is communicating them, who's ordering them? Obviously we have famous examples, but in how many cases is it just sort of a straight up slogging match? Two armies just going at each other, bouncing back, forward, back.
And someone reported it all in some nuanced way that perhaps wasn't necessarily how it played out, as you said. It was just people slogging at it.
Yeah, there's famous examples. There is, Kinoscephali, I think, with the maniples that move back behind the line. Charonia, where Alexander just finds the weak spot in the Greek line and charges in, but so many others just seem to be sort of perhaps just a straight up.
This is still, I would say, within the ambit of ancient warfare, but how about any battle taking place in roughly the 5th or 6th century AD between the sub-Roman Britons and the Saxon invaders? Because I would be able to solve, is that King Arthur or someone in command there? I would like to know, or I would not say he was a king, but I would like to know who was that figure, maybe in command of the British forces, somewhere around the early 6th century BC, fighting the Saxons. What was he doing there? Certainly, the possibilities are endless.
So Murray, we put the question to you. You emailed back 3, being greedy. So if you have your 3 possible suggestions of ones that you would like to witness, you had to pick one. I'll pick one that you've not
Oh.
listed here. Which would your preference be?
Mine would be to see the Battle of Marathon, for reasons of we have, where were the cavalry, what exactly happened, all of those sorts of issues with the sources, but also for the sheer import of the battle in terms of, was it as big a deal in terms of the Greek hoplites first meeting with the Persians, and what actually happened, and just to see again, I'm in a drone or I'm overhead. I'm not actually in the shield wall. Although that would be another amazing reality. Yeah, all of those sorts of things in terms of how to do. Did we move to the right to shuffle into the shield of the person next to us? Did we? Did they run? What was the run? How did the wings sweep forward? How deep was the phalanx depth? All those sorts of questions. Again, if you paid attention, you could answer them instantly. And again, even numbers. The sources for Marathon. Justin says there's 600,000 Persians, and one of the other sources, Simonides, has an epigram which says 90,000 Persians. And again, all modern sources, we round that down completely to between 18 and 24,000, because the numbers are incredible, and therefore but at the same time we accept the 11,000 hoplites on the Athenian and Plataean side, and numbers in ancient battles would be great. Take a photograph, like I can count them all. There you go. I've got a really good resolution camera. The army was that big. And all of those sorts of things. And then, like we're talking about the carnage, that if, according to Herodotus, the Athenians lose 192, the Plataeans lose 11, and there's 6,000 Persian dead. So that, what was an ancient battle, how quick did they happen? How soon after the shield wall broke did an ancient battle fall apart? There's so many.
Well, you can extrapolate from seeing one to others.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So those sorts of questions of.
No, you don't do that, because then you still have decades of academic discussion left. Yeah. We have one. How valuable is it for the rest?
Yeah, the depth of the shield wall. That old chestnut where we do that all the time. We get one battle where a depth of a shield wall is mentioned, and we extrapolate that to every other battle. Or same like with the Corvus, you've got battles where they're mentioned and then they're not mentioned again. Is that because they were simply becoming part of the understood aspect of battle, or is it because they, stopped being used?
But it's the same thing as Marc said. We have this idea that there was always 40 Marines on a Roman warship. I don't think that's based on more than one source for one event at one time, unless you can correct me. But
I wonder too. The problem I have with Polybius is when you're talking about the First Punic War, he's the only real source that we have, apart from stray references and what have you. When I say that he's the closest in time. He writes with authority. He's clearly a fine historian, and yet he is not writing a military history in the modern sense of that term. He's writing a history, and sometimes the things that he doesn't say can be enormously frustrating. That is, he'll pass over a colossal defeat for the Carthaginians, where I think the Romans captured 114, the Battle of Cape Hermaeum, 114 Carthaginian quinquerenes in a sentence. He doesn't give any explanation of tactics or how it happened. He getting back to the Corvus, he doesn't talk. He talks a lot about this device and then doesn't talk about it for the rest of his history ever. Why not? What was he? And partly that can be explained is that he was writing a history for Greek civilians, trying to explain how the Romans became the greatest power in the world. He was not writing the military history of the Roman Empire, and so a lot of stuff is left out. But what he was really doing was, I guess you would call it more of a political science, where he's talking about how Roman institutions and obviously the military is part of it, but he was not writing military history in the sense that we would know that term. So leaving certain things out, that's not something that would necessarily have troubled him. It troubles us, but
I wondered if well, I was thinking I was going to go to our I had a point, but I was going to go to our patrons. Thank you very much. We put the question out to our patrons on Patreon. If you like the show, you can find us on patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. And we put the question out, what would they like to witness? Now, Angus, not me, our patron Angus, came up with Alesia. And this ties into what I was thinking about, maybe also the Siege of Tyre, which is kind of the fact that it's not necessarily that you want to see the set piece battle, because it's just the scale of the fortifications, the scale of Tyre, Alexander, building that causeway. It's a feat rather than necessarily a large set piece. And no one's mentioned Alesia. I thought that was a dead cert to want to see. Julius Caesar. You're not interested?
I would like to know exactly by seeing it the numbers, because isn't it something like that Caesar said that there were 80,000 Gauls in Alesia, and then he's besieged himself by 250,000 coming from all around. That's striking me as being an exceptionally large number. So I would certainly say that we could potentially solve that issue right there.
Well, there's just such a lot of wall building going on in a short period of time. I just think would be awesome to see. Not only would it be breathtaking to see it being built, it would be breathtaking to see it, as a structure just there completed.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that'd be cool. I'm not sure I'd want to see, the families of the Celtic warriors being driven out and starving to death. Might be a less popular part of the whole thing.
Because what I was thinking, right, if I didn't know that the things like the pyramids existed, if I didn't know that the Colosseum existed, you might sort of think some of these feats of siege works were impossible. But when you know that these big things really do exist, these siege works, suddenly you start thinking, well, they're undoubtedly there's got to be something in it. These are not just flights of fancy. And I should have made a note how many miles of wall that they put up. It is a tremendous amount they sort of threw up.
It's amazing what you can do if you have a lot of hands that are used to work.
Yeah, well, even encamping at the end of a day's march, just to watch a Roman legion make a camp would be amazing.
Yeah, but seriously, I don't think when do you see nowadays, several thousand people who know what to do when it comes to building something, or digging a ditch and building a palisade, who have the tools, who have the experience and the training. It probably would go pretty quick, but what's the closest thing you might see? A chain gang?
Don't have those in Australia anymore. That whole sort of group activity where you're all pulling together and mucking together and those sorts of things happen. But as Jasper says, it's amazing what people coordinated can do when they all know what they have to do and they all have a task. But even still, it would be amazing to watch one of those marching camps go up. And even, we've got several handbooks on how to lay out a camp and what was done. Is that what they did? Did they use surveyors? Or did people just, get told? And we've got other camps where they just dossed down where they were, did nothing.
Certainly, from a witness point of view, it would be easier to document and witness perhaps the confusion of a battle.
That's for sure.
You really could get the skinny on it.
Yeah.
Marc on Patreon asks any battles of the Mithridatic Wars, the river Aminas, to see how the Scythed Chariots work. Scythed Chariots, ooh, there's one.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Did they work? Because they
If
never.
you like your blood and guts, I guess so.
Yeah. They never seem to work. They always get. They're certainly not decisive, even though they get put into battles again and again, and we use the word terror weapon, and the sources talk about the fear of them, but then that's never realized in the outcome. So it would be interesting to see how a scythed chariot works, and how whether Hollywood has it accurate. I would imagine not. Although it would be very interesting to find out if that's what was true.
I'd like to see how any chariot worked. Now that you mention it, what interesting book, wonderful book, The End of the Bronze Age by Robert Drews. You familiar with this? It posits that the chariot warrior aristocracy that had owned the late Bronze Age, so we're talking the 15th, 14th, and 13th centuries BC, that they were overwhelmed by infantry in the form of the chariot runners, who would ordinarily have accompanied, followed behind the chariot warrior aristocrats to finish off downed opponents and what have you. And that in time, the chariot runners would learn that they could meet and defeat the chariot warriors themselves. And it's a very convincing case. One of the things I wonder about is how is it that the chariot warriors had dominated the ancient Near Eastern battlefield for so many centuries if they were potentially so vulnerable to infantry. And I would like to see, for example, you're familiar with the whole concept of the collapse of the Bronze Age and the fall of the palaces, and every Near Eastern state fell except for Egypt, which was able to defeat the attack of the Sea Peoples. What was it about these Sea People invaders that they were able to overcome the chariot warriors who had dominated the Near East for several centuries? That is something that if I could see what they were doing, I think that would be very interesting.
We've touched upon Gaugamela already, but Dustin wonders, if you could see it, it would be interesting to compare it to Oliver Stone's version. Again, maybe as a witness, that would be how you viewed it, in your run.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Gaugamela and Oliver Stone. It is a movie, and so I can only talk about what I see is happening in Oliver Stone's movie and compare it to what I know about the battle. I think that Stone's film, it does convey that Alexander, at the beginning of the Gaugamela battle, there was a movement to the your Alexander's on the right wing of the Macedonian battle line, and he's in command of the cavalry. He made a movement to the right and drew off several Persian units, which you kind of see them riding off, shadowing each other, or something like that. And then he launches his attack towards Darius. The question I would have is, and this is the supposition, the theory of what actually happened in that battle, that apparently too much of the Persian front line, the cavalry, followed Alexander in to shadow his movement. So Alexander is moving to his right, whereas the Persians then move off to their left, and that too many of them moved off to the left and created a gap through which Alexander then turned back left and struck at Darius directly. I would like to see exactly what happened. Was there possibly a mistake made in terms of who was ordered to leave, or did certain units follow the Persian cavalry, did they follow units that were supposed to move, but they were supposed to stay in place, and yet they left anyway and left the king vulnerable? That I think would be interesting.
Jasper mentioned, I think it was, you mentioned earlier, you probably just see a lot of dust if you went to witness these things. The one thing about the Oliver Stone film is there is a hell of a lot of dust in the Oliver Stone film,
right.
Which does make you wonder how he knew what was going on with this other cavalry unit also shadowing him. How he could see through them and the dust and all the swirl to know when to turn.
I think in the movie it's actually sort of suggested that Alexander uses the dust as well to hide the moment that he's turning around. I suppose Gaugamela, as shown in the Oliver Stone movie, is one of the best depictions of an ancient battle in movie ever. But I don't think it, for instance, there's a theory that there was a bad omen, eclipse of the moon, just before the battle, which might have suggested to at least Persian astrologers or astronomers. I'm not sure which one.
Synonymous.
Yeah, well, that something really bad was coming for the king and for the Persian dynasty, so that Persian morale was very low, and that sort of changes the story of the battle a bit. But I don't know. Can we show?
Yeah, how do you witness morale?
I don't. Yeah, that's another one. There is really, if you think about it, there is so much we don't know, or we have to glean from, bits of sources here and there to try and make our story of what happens at an ancient battle complete.
Well, I have a winner, but as of what and it's not one of our suggestions so far. It's one of the Patreon suggestions for what I think will be the greatest battle to see.
Mm-hmm.
And Zama. I wondered. Alejandro suggests Zama, and I tell you why. I thought if you want to see a battle, Zama surely has everything. You've got elephants. You've got everything sort of there, laid out. It's almost like
we're not going to do the discussion of whether Zama happened at all or not, right?
Well, two giant enemies. It's a film in itself.
Yeah, that's true. I think it has been. Haven't the Italians made a movie about that?
There's Scipio Africanus by back in 1936. Guerra, what is it? I think it's victory or death is their phrase that they go. It's one of the few battles where you actually get Pila thrown in a film. Most of the films of ancient Roman battle don't show anything being thrown because it's too dangerous. So yeah, Zama's there, and they've got the channels to let the elephants go through and things like that. But yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be? It would be so interesting to be in, not on the victorious side, provided, of course, you can guarantee your safety. But to be in the Roman legions,
your press flak jacket on.
Yeah, to be in the Roman legions at Cannae, to have that sense, like we were just talking about before I disappeared again, of morale, because the Romans in Cannae, for instance, they were going forward, they were winning, and then suddenly they're double enveloped and massacred. And I mean, even, the grisly business of how do you kill 80,000 men in one day? How do you do that? Or, whether it's Caesar against the Helvetii, where he wipes out the entire tribe in a night. That's some very bloody business. But yeah, all of those would just be fascinating to be involved in.
Well, shall we leave it at that? I think next time, Jasper, what we're talking about next time we're out? What's the next issue of the magazine?
Ancient Warfare 11.2 is in fact just out. That is actually the third. I kind of realized when we were working on it, it's become the third issue about early or middle Republican Rome and how Rome manages to unify Italy and forge an empire out of all those different peoples. It was interesting to do because I did my one before myself, Ancient Warfare 4.1, and then under Yosho's tenure there was issue 7.2, I think, and this one is a lot more focused really on about 300 BC, where it becomes clear that it's inevitable that Rome is going to capture the entire peninsula. And it ends sort of just about when the Tarentines are going to go, hey, there, Mr. Pyrrhus, can we have a chat? So we can talk about that next time.
Yeah, there we go, next time out. So thank you, Jasper, Mary and Marc. If you enjoyed us chatting, why not consider becoming a patron of the podcast? We try to slip you extras when we can and get you involved in the recording of the show. Hopefully those patrons help us make the show more interesting for everybody else. To find out how to become a patron, go to patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. So that's it for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.